The crew arrived at 5:50 in the morning, 3 men, a flatbed truck, a concrete saw, and a hydraulic breaker that made a sound like a thunderclap when it first hit the foundation. I was sitting on my front porch with a thermos of coffee, watching. My neighbor Beverly Marsh was at her bedroom window, curtain pulled back, watching too. She had been awake all night, according to her daughter, who texted me the evening before, not because she was worried, but because some part of her apparently still believed, even at that final hour, that something would stop this from happening. Nothing stopped it. Nothing was ever going to stop it, because the demolition order wasn't mine. It was the county's. And when a county-ordered demolition arrives at sunrise with proper documentation and a licensed crew, there is nothing a homeowner, an HOA president, or anyone with a clipboard and a belief in their own authority can do except stand at the window and watch their mistake get corrected one concrete slab at a time. My name is Preston Okafor. I am 48 years old and I have owned my home in Lakewood Terrace, a subdivision outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana, for 11 years. The house is a 4-bedroom brick ranch on a corner lots being somewhat distinctive in Lakewood Terrace because they tend to have slightly more complex driveway and access configurations than standard interior lots, given the way the development street grid intersects at those corners. My specific driveway runs along the left side of my property, entering from the side street rather than the main street my house technically faces, a configuration established by the developer when the neighborhood was originally platted and recorded in my deed with precise survey coordinates that define the driveway's path, width, and the easement strip along which it runs to my detached garage at the rear of the property. I want to be precise about this driveway's legal status because it is the entire center of what eventually happened. The driveway easement is formally recorded in the parish property records. It exists not merely as an informal path I've always used, but as a documented, surveyed, legally established easement strip that runs along a specific path at a specific width from the side street to my garage. This easement predates my ownership, predates the previous owner's tenure, and is as permanent a feature of my property's legal description as the property lines themselves. My neighbor Beverly Marsh owns the lot directly adjacent to this easement strip. Her property line runs along the easement's outer edge, not through it, not overlapping it, but precisely at its boundary as established in the original subdivision plat recorded with the parish in the early 1990s. Beverly and I had, for most of my 11 years in Lakewood Terrace, a relationship I would describe as pleasantly neutral. We were not close friends, but we were good neighbors in the practical sense, aware of each other, occasionally helpful during storms or yard work, and in general agreement that the strip of grass running along the driveway easement line was, and had always been, simply where my driveway ran and where her property ended. That understanding, apparently, did not survive Beverly becoming HOA president. Beverly was elected HOA president for Lakewood Terrace about 3 years before the events of this story, running on a platform of community beautification and property value protection that resonated with enough residents to win her the position fairly comfortably. In her first 2 years as president, Beverly focused primarily on genuinely reasonable things, getting the community entrance replanted after a long-neglected landscaping situation, addressing some long-standing issues with the shared drainage infrastructure, pushing for updated signage throughout the development. I had no objections to any of this, and in fact, voted for her both times her seat came up for community ratification. The change in Beverly's approach to the HOA presidency, and specifically to her relationship with my property, began roughly 18 months before the demolition morning, when Beverly began planning what she described to several neighbors as her dream project. A large detached garage and workshop on her own property, designed to give her husband Leonard's woodworking hobby a proper dedicated space, and to add a second garage structure that, in Beverly's estimation, would significantly increase their home's value. This project was, in concept, entirely reasonable. The problem emerged in the planning and execution, specifically in the decision Beverly and Leonard made about where, exactly, to place this new structure. Beverly and Leonard retained a local contractor for the garage project, a man named Dale Fontenot, who had done some other residential work in the Lakewood Terrace area over the years. From what I've been able to piece together since the incident, Dale raised initial concerns about the proposed placement of the garage, specifically noting that the structure as designed would sit very close to, and potentially within, the recorded driveway easement running along my property line. What happened next is something I learned only through documents that emerged during the subsequent legal process, but which I think matters significantly for understanding the full picture. Beverly and Leonard, when they submitted their building permit application to the parish, described the structure's placement in their application documents in a way that, according to the permit reviewer's subsequent account, was ambiguous enough about the easement's presence and precise location that the permit was issued without the kind of detailed easement review that would have caught the encroachment before a single shovel of earth was turned. This was, I want to be clear, not necessarily intentional misrepresentation on Beverly's part. It may have been a genuine oversight, a failure to fully understand how the permit application needed to accurately describe the relationship between the proposed structure and my recorded easement. But the practical result was the same regardless of intent. A building permit was issued for a structure that, as designed and as ultimately built, placed its foundation and a significant portion of its floor slab directly over my recorded driveway easement. I first became aware that something significant was happening next door when the excavation equipment arrived on a Tuesday morning about 14 months before the demolition. I want to walk through what I observed during the construction process carefully because my own decisions during this period, specifically about when and how to respond, matter significantly to how the situation ultimately resolved. When the excavation began, I walked over to the property line and watched for a few minutes before approaching Dale Fontenot, whom I recognized from a previous job he'd done for a different neighbor down the street. I introduced myself, explained that I owned the adjacent property and that there was a recorded driveway easement running along that boundary, and asked whether the new structure's placement had been verified against the easement's recorded coordinates. Dale told me he had the survey stakes out and was confident the structure was set back properly from the property line. I told him the issue wasn't the property line itself, but the easement strip running inside my property line, which had its own recorded coordinates and which existed independently of where the property line sat. Dale looked at me for a moment and then said he'd check with Beverly. I did not hear back from Dale or Beverly that day. The excavation continued. 2 days later, I sent Beverly a written note, physical, hand-delivered to her door, because I wanted a clear record of the communication, explaining my concern about the easement's recorded location and requesting that she have the contractor verify the structure's placement against the easement survey coordinates before the foundation was poured. Beverly did not respond to this note. The foundation was poured the following Monday. Calling an attorney. After the foundation was poured, I called a property attorney named Sylvia Browsard, who had handled some matters related to my original purchase of the Lakewood Terrace property and who I trusted to give me an accurate, clear assessment of the situation. I described what I'd observed and what I'd communicated to Beverly and provided Sylvia with copies of my deed, the original subdivision plat showing the easement's recorded coordinates, and photographs I'd taken during the construction process. Sylvia reviewed these materials and called me back the following morning with a clear assessment. She said the photographic evidence I'd provided, compared against the survey coordinates in the recorded easement documentation, strongly suggested the foundation slab had been poured in a position that encroached on my easement strip. She said this needed to be confirmed through a formal survey, and that we needed to move quickly given that additional construction on top of the slab would only complicate any eventual enforcement action. I commissioned a licensed survey that week. The survey was completed in 4 days, and the results were definitive. The garage foundation slab encroached on my recorded driveway easement by between 18 and 22 inches along approximately 38 feet of the structure's length, with the encroachment greatest at the structure's corner closest to my driveway's actual traveled surface. Sylvia sent Beverly a formal cease and desist letter within 24 hours of receiving the survey results, with a certified copy of the survey attached, demanding an immediate halt to all further construction and requesting Beverly's immediate response regarding remediation. Beverly's response. Beverly's response to Sylvia's cease and desist letter arrived 4 days after delivery, through an attorney of her own, a man named Patrick Delacroix, who practiced general civil litigation in Baton Rouge. Delacroix's letter disputed the encroachment finding on several grounds, the most significant of which was an argument I had not anticipated. He claimed, on Beverly's behalf, that because the driveway easement ran along the boundary of my property, and because Beverly's lot was adjacent to mine at exactly that boundary, the easement should be understood as a shared or mutual arrangement that Beverly had some right to build within, provided she did not physically block my actual vehicle access to the driveway. This argument was, as Sylvia explained to me with a certain dry precision, a misunderstanding of how easements work that was creative but not legally supportable. A recorded driveway easement is not a shared arrangement. It is a defined strip of land with specific recorded dimensions within which the easement holder, me, has exclusive rights to maintain and use for the specified purpose. The fact that the strip runs along a property boundary does not create any mutual interest for the adjacent property owner. Beverly's lot ended at the boundary. The easement began there. Sylvia sent back a detailed response explaining this legal reality and reiterating the demand that construction cease and a remediation plan be presented. She also filed a formal complaint with the parish building department, attaching the certified survey and requesting that the department review the building permit's accuracy given the encroachment finding. Beverly's construction continued while these communications were exchanged. The framing stage went up, then the roof. By the time Sylvia had exhausted the informal communication phase and filed for a court order, Beverly's dream garage was a fully framed, partially roofed structure sitting 18 to 22 inches over my recorded easement across 38 feet of its length. The court proceedings. Sylvia filed for a mandatory injunction in Parish District Court, a court order requiring Beverly to remove the encroaching portions of the structure and restore the easement strip to its prior condition. She also filed a formal title cloud complaint, documenting the easement encroachment in the public record in a way that would affect Beverly's ability to sell or refinance her property until the encroachment was resolved. Beverly and Patrick Delacroix filed a response contesting the injunction, making several arguments, the most significant of which was a renewed version of the shared easement theory, along with a new claim that my note to Dale during construction had been insufficient notice, and that I should have acted more quickly to prevent the foundation from being poured rather than simply watching it happen and sending a certified letter afterward. The judge, a woman named Honorable Renee Thibodeaux, who presided over property matters in this district, heard arguments from both sides over 2 sessions. I want to describe what happened at the end of that second session, because I think it reflects how completely Beverly's legal position had been undermined by the weight of the actual documented evidence. Judge Thibodeaux ruled from the bench. She noted that the recorded easement was unambiguous, that the certified survey established the encroachment with precision, that the cease and desist communication had provided Beverly clear, formal notice before the structure was framed, and that Beverly's decision to continue construction after receiving that notice, rather than pausing to allow proper legal review of the easement question, significantly weakened any argument that she had acted in good faith. She issued the mandatory injunction, ordering Beverly to remove all encroaching structure within 60 days and assessed court costs against Beverly. She also said something I remember specifically because it addressed Beverly's claim that I should have acted faster to prevent the foundation pour. She said, the burden to verify compliance with recorded easements before breaking ground falls on the builder, not on the easement holder. Mr. Okafor provided written notice before the foundation was poured. His obligation was met. End of Part 1. Beverly did not comply within 60 days. She submitted an appeal of the injunction and simultaneously filed a motion for a stay pending the appeal. Both motions were handled by Sylvia with what I'd describe as methodical efficiency. The stay motion was opposed on grounds that my easement rights were being actively, continuously violated by every day the structure remained in place, and the stay was denied. The appeal itself, filed with the appellate court, was reviewed and ultimately denied approximately 4 months after the original injunction was issued, with the appellate panel affirming Judge Thibodeaux's ruling without modification. At this point, Beverly had exhausted every available legal mechanism to delay or prevent compliance. The 60-day compliance window from the original injunction had long expired. Sylvia returned to Judge Thibodeaux and requested enforcement authorization, specifically authorization for me to retain a licensed contractor to perform the demolition and remediation at Beverly's expense, given her failure to comply voluntarily. Judge Thibodeaux issued the enforcement authorization within 2 weeks. I hired a contractor. A start date was set. Sylvia notified Beverly's attorney of the date in writing, which was legally required. Beverly's daughter texted me the evening before the demolition to tell me Beverly had been awake all night. I went to bed at 10 o'clock, set my alarm for 5:15, and slept soundly. Part 2. Sunrise. The crew arrived at 5:50. 3 men, a flatbed with the hydraulic breaker, and a concrete saw for the foundation work after the framing came down. I was on my front porch with a thermos of coffee and my copy of the enforcement authorization, which I had no expectation of needing to show, but which I kept in my hand anyway out of a kind of instinct for being prepared. I want to describe the first 30 minutes of that demolition morning carefully, because the specific sequence of events reflects something important about how this entire situation had been structured from beginning to end. The lead contractor, a man named Terence Guidry, who ran a small demolition and site-clearing operation, and who Sylvia had specifically recommended given his experience with court-ordered remediation work, reviewed his paperwork at the truck before approaching the structure. He confirmed the enforcement authorization, walked the property line with a measuring tape to verify exactly which portions of the structure fell within the encroachment zone, and marked his cut lines with spray paint before a single tool was raised. This precision, doing the measurement first, marking the lines, operating within exactly the defined scope of the court order, was, I realized watching it, exactly the right way to handle this kind of work. Not aggressive, not theatrical, just methodical compliance with a court's lawful order. Beverly's bedroom window curtain moved at approximately 6:10, shortly after the hydraulic breaker made its first contact with the foundation slab at the encroachment line. I saw her face at the glass for a moment. Then the curtain closed again. The concrete saw began at 6:25, cutting the clean separation line between the encroaching portion and the legitimate portion of the slab, a process that took about 40 minutes along the 38-foot length. By 8:30, the encroaching portions of the framing had been removed and loaded onto the flatbed. By 10:15, the foundation sections within my easement strip had been broken up, removed, and the subgrade below restored to grade. Terence's crew cleaned up their debris carefully, leaving the easement strip essentially bare ground ready for whatever surface restoration followed. Terence handed me a signed completion certificate at approximately 10:45. I thanked him and went inside to make a second pot of coffee. Beverly comes outside. Beverly came out of her house at around 11 o'clock that morning, after Terence's crew had already left. She stood at the edge of her property and looked at what remained, the legitimate portion of her garage structure, which was still intact, since the demolition had been precisely limited to the encroaching sections, and then looked at the bare easement strip where the encroaching foundation had been. I was in my kitchen at this point, visible through my window. Beverly saw me, and for a moment I thought she might come to my door. She did not. She stood there for perhaps 3 minutes, then went back inside. We did not speak that day. We have not spoken at length since, beyond the minimal acknowledgement of adult neighbors in close residential proximity. Beverly remained in Lakewood Terrace, though she resigned from the HOA presidency approximately 6 weeks after the demolition, citing personal circumstances requiring her attention. Leonard eventually had a smaller, properly sited workshop structure built on a different portion of their property, set back from the easement, properly permitted, properly surveyed before breaking ground. I watched this second construction project proceed from the same front porch where I'd watched the first one, and felt nothing about it beyond mild satisfaction that the process had finally worked correctly. The costs BVRLY absorbed. I want to address the financial dimension of this situation clearly, because I think it reflects something important about the real-world consequences of building without properly verifying easements. Beverly's total costs from this situation, as best I've been able to calculate based on what emerged through the legal process, included legal fees for Patrick Delacroix's representation through the injunction proceeding, the appeal, and the appeal's denial, the costs of the construction work on the original encroaching structure, which was partially demolished, the court costs assessed by Judge Thibodeaux, and the largest single item, the costs of the remediation work itself, which Sylvia filed as a judgment against Beverly in the amount of approximately $14,300, covering Terence Guidry's full invoice, plus the costs I had incurred in the litigation process that had made the enforcement action necessary, combined with her own legal fees. Beverly's total financial exposure from this situation was approximately $31,000, more than the entire garage project would have cost if it had been properly sited from the beginning, which multiple contractors could have confirmed with a simple easement verification before the first shovel went into the ground. Sylvia pointed this out to me in our final conversation about the matter with a kind of professional weariness that I think reflected how often she had seen this specific pattern play out. A homeowner skips the easement verification step, a structure goes up in the wrong place, and by the time the problem is formally identified and litigated to conclusion, the cost of fixing it is multiples of what verification would have cost at the outset. One afternoon, with a licensed surveyor confirming the easement coordinates before Dale Fontenot's crew broke ground, would have cost Beverly somewhere between $400 and $800. The driveway today. My driveway runs exactly where it has always run, along the easement strip that has been recorded in the parish property records since this subdivision was platted in the early 1990s. The surface restoration work, replacing the gravel and compacted base that had been partially disturbed during the remediation, was completed about 3 weeks after the demolition, and the driveway has been fully operational and unobstructed since then. I drive along that driveway every day, pulling into and out of my detached garage at the rear of my lot, and I'll admit that I don't think about any of this very often anymore. The situation resolved. The easement is clear. The legal record documents what happened and why. What I do think about occasionally is the specific sequence that led to the outcome. The written note delivered before the foundation pour, the commissioned survey that confirmed what the note had warned about, Sylvia's systematic legal work that built an airtight record at every stage, and the enforcement authorization that ultimately gave Terence Guidry and his crew the legal standing to arrive at sunrise and do the work that should never have been necessary in the first place. No single piece of that sequence was dramatic or surprising in isolation. Combined, they produced the only outcome that was ever legally possible once a structure was built over a recorded easement, regardless of how many attorneys filed appeals, how many stay motions were submitted, or how many nights were spent awake wondering whether something would finally stop what was coming. Nothing stopped it. Nothing was ever going to stop it. What I want anyone reading this to know. I've been asked, more than once since this situation concluded, what I would say to someone just starting to realize that a neighbor is building something close to an easement or a property boundary in a way that might create exactly the problem Beverly's project created. The answer is the same every time. Act early, act in writing, and document everything from the first moment. The written note I delivered before Beverly's foundation was poured was not a dramatic or aggressive move. It was simply what anyone who understands how property disputes work knows to do: create a written record at the earliest possible point, establishing that you raised the concern before the problem became more expensive and complicated than it needed to be. Sylvia later told me that this note, more than anything else in our entire legal file, was the single most important document we had, because it established, beyond any possible dispute, that Beverly had received specific, clear, written warning about the easement issue before she proceeded with the work that made the whole situation necessary. One note, delivered by hand, kept as a photo on my phone. That is what started the chain of documentation that ended with Terence Guidry's hydraulic breaker at 5:50 on a sunrise morning, doing work that was court-ordered, legally authorized, and absolutely inevitable. That's the whole story.